For those who don't know me yet, I'm Jana Rasser. I used to be a postdoc at the Complexity Science Hub until 2 months ago. Now I'm a postdoc at the Graz University of Technology. And yeah, my talk for you today will be about mental health and working conditions of doctoral researchers, and also a bit about how to organize to drive change. This talk is, I guess, a bit unusual given the talks that you usually hear in this CSH colloquia. Of course, it will be a bit about science. There will be lots of data showing working conditions of doctoral researchers, detailing how the supervision usually goes, and also focusing on the topic of mental health. But what makes this talk a bit unusual is that there will also be a fair bit of what I call activism. So how to organize, to collect data, how to identify challenges, and how to find and implement solutions with the aim of driving change. Yeah, so the overview of my talk, what I'm going to talk to you about is, first of all, I'm going to introduce the Max Planck PhDnet. This is the PhD representation organization that I was part of during my own PhD, and where all the data I'm going to present to you and all the experiences and insights I'm going to present to you stem from, basically. Then I'm going to go a bit into demographics and working conditions of doctoral researchers in general, and then into supervision and challenges in supervision, and as I already said, mental health. And I will end my talk with what I call the ingredients to drive change. Okay, so let's jump right in. The Max Planck PhDnet. Before I can talk about the Max Planck PhDnet, I actually need to talk about the Max Planck Society, the research organization that hosts the Max Planck PhDnet. The Max Planck Society has 86 research institutes. Of those, 81 are based in Germany and 5 are abroad. Sadly, none of them in Austria. It has an annual budget of about 2 billion euros. And the research that is being done in the Max Planck Society is focused in 3 very broad sections. The first is the chemistry, physics, and technology section, short CPT. You will see this acronym later on when I present the survey data a lot, because we use these scientific sections to disaggregate the data a bit. The second section is the biology and medicine section, short BM. And the third section, which is also the smallest of the 3 sections, is the humanities section, which also includes 3 institutes that do primarily law. The Max Planck Society is one of the 4 largest non-university research organizations in Germany. It has about 24,000 employees. Of those, about half are researchers, and of those, about 5,000 are doctoral researchers pursuing their PhD. Well, and those 5,000 doctoral researchers are employed by the Max Planck Society, but formally they do their PhD at a university, because in Germany, as I guess also in Austria, only universities have the right to award PhD degrees. The PhD in Germany, very similar to the one in Austria, requires a master's degree to start, and it takes 3 to 5 years. I mention this because this is a bit different from the Anglo-Saxon area, where people can also start a PhD degree with a bachelor's, and the PhD usually takes a bit longer and includes a lot of classes in the beginning. Most German universities allow for both a cumulative thesis, meaning that you can publish a couple of papers and then publish those with an intro and a conclusion as a thesis and get a degree, as well as a monography. So no published paper and just a write-up of what you did. In my experience, having worked both in Austria and in Germany, the conditions in Germany and Austria and also in Switzerland for doing a PhD are rather similar. That's why I think the info that I'm going to present in my talk is probably also quite interesting for people who are currently doing their PhD in Austria. These 5,000 doctoral researchers that work in the Max Planck Society are represented by the Max Planck PhDnet. The Max Planck PhDnet understands itself as the representation, the lobbying organization that stands in for the rights of doctoral researchers, is concerned with their mental and physical well-being, and furthering their careers. The backbone of the Max Planck PhDnet are the elected representatives. So every one of the 86 institutes has an elected representative. Well, that's a bit of an overstatement. Usually we are at around 81, 82 elected representatives. A couple of institutes don't manage to elect one every year. These institutes also usually band together in what we call regional hubs. Because as you have seen in the map I showed at the beginning, the Max Planck Society's institutes are spread all over Germany, and usually institutes that are close together in space, like in the same city. For example, in Munich, there are, I think, 8 institutes. Even though they might not share a discipline, they still share the struggles of doing a PhD or being an early career researcher, and they often get together and have social things or organize career fairs and stuff. What the elected representatives also do is every year they gather in an annual meeting, and the representatives elect the steering group, which is a group of 6 people that steers the Max Planck PhDnet for the coming year. The steering group usually consists of a spokesperson and a deputy spokesperson, a general secretary, and 3 representatives, one for each of the 3 disciplinary sections of the Max Planck Society. The institute representatives also form working groups, and those working groups come together to further the agenda of the Max Planck PhDnet in different areas. For example, there is a career working group that organizes career fairs, that organizes conferences, has now a career podcast even. There's an equal opportunities working group that works on position papers and tries to identify challenges for equal opportunities in the society and proposes changes. And one of the working groups, I think probably the most important one, is also the survey working group. This working group organizes a survey among all doctoral researchers every year that asks about the experience of doing a PhD. And this is where all the data comes from, that all the policy efforts that the Max Planck PhDnet pushes is based on. Kind of my own path through that organization was that I started as an institute representative in 2015. That was the year when I started my PhD. I actually was elected by accident. I thought I was running for something else. I wasn't very familiar with the system yet. And then suddenly I was institute representative. Then I joined the first annual meeting, and from that I was basically hooked, because the energy of all these people that are really into it and want to change and improve the system is really, really nice and breathtaking. And from then I joined the survey group, where I worked for a year. And after that, I was part of the steering group for 2 years. For the first year as representative for the chemistry, physics, and technology section. And for my last year, I was the spokesperson of the PhDnet. The PhDnet exists since 23, so for almost 20 years. And throughout its existence, I think it has quite some successes to name. First of all, we managed to get elected representatives in almost all of the 86 institutes. As I already said, this is a substantial success because, for example, only about 60 institutes of the Max Planck Society managed to have a works council, a Betriebsrat. So the PhDnet is actually more widespread than the works councils. Then in 2015, the Max Planck PhDnet managed to push for a change from stipends to contracts for doctoral researchers. This was a very important change because stipends are a very precarious way to employ doctoral researchers, because then they don't get their social benefits and health insurance is quite difficult. And then in 2019, we managed to increase the number of paid vacation days from 20 to 30, which was very well received by the doctoral researchers. We got a lot of vacation pictures this year, or that year. And then in 2020, we managed to increase the base salary of doctoral researchers from 50% to 65%. but this is still not 100%. 15% salary increase, I think, is quite okay. Okay. Well, as I already said, lots of the things we achieve or lots of the policy changes we pushed are based on our annual survey. So this survey every year maps the experience of all the 5,000 PhDs across the Max Planck Society with about 100 to 120 questions about a range of topics. Usually there are core topics. Those topics stay the same in every year to also map out temporal changes. Those core topics include demographics, working conditions, supervision, and career perspectives. And then every year there is also a changing selection of topics depending on the current circumstances and what is currently on the minds of the doctoral researchers. For example, mental health, good scientific practice, and also recently power abuse. This survey is completely community organized. The Max Planck Society itself does not support this survey in any way. It also doesn't hinder the survey, but they don't pay for it and they don't support or provide any infrastructure. So this is completely an effort of the PhDnet, and it usually gets a response rate of 50%. And for anybody who has run such a survey or a similar survey in the past, you will recognize that a 50% response rate is very substantial for such a survey. And this really speaks to the success of the PhDnet because it manages to reach almost all of the people that it represents. Well, almost all, 50%, but that's a quite high number comparatively. This survey produces numbers every year, and what is going to follow is basically an insight into the results of this survey. I'll start easy and basic and map out the demographics and working conditions of doctoral researchers as they are in the Max Planck Society, and I think they are also pretty comparable to other universities and research institutions in the German-speaking area. So first of all, doctoral researchers are by now very international. We usually find that the percentage of German researchers is about 40%, then there's another 20% coming from within the European Union, and another about 35% are citizens from outside the European Union. This is an important finding because it really shows that communication in German is not enough and that everything needs to be organized such that international researchers can thrive. We also find that over all of the Max Planck Society, gender is rather balanced. There are a bit more male-identifying doctoral researchers than female-identifying doctoral researchers, and quite a fair amount of people who identify with other gender representations. And then there is, of course, the usual pattern that we see that in the chemistry, physics, and technology section, the male-identifying researchers are overrepresented, whereas in the humanities, the female-identifying researchers are overrepresented. Doctoral researchers are between 20 and 30 years old. That's no surprise because doctoral research usually start their project after a master's. On average, they're 26 years old, and this is also not different between female and male-identifying doctoral researchers. What we can also see, though, is that the spread is actually quite high. So there is a fair number of doctoral researchers that are older than 30 years, and there are also actually some that are quite young. And this is also an important finding because it means that doctoral research, the working conditions have to be considered for a range of circumstances. It's not so uncommon that doctoral researchers are at an age where they think about founding a family, and supporting that from an organizational perspective is actually important for doctoral researchers as well. It doesn't only start at the postdoc level or even the senior postdoc level. What we also see in these surveys is that unpaid overtime among doctoral researchers is widespread. The overtime has an asterisk here. because most of the doctoral researchers in the Max Planck Society are only employed for 65% of the time, meaning about 25 hours per week. And what we can see is that the average hours worked per week for all doctoral researchers are between 46 and 50. So even for a 40-hour per week contract, this is a substantial amount of overtime. But if you consider that those people are actually only employed for 25 hours of the week, this is they work basically about double as much as they are employed for. What's also interesting here is that males actually seem to consistently work a bit more than female identifying doctoral researchers. And the biomedical section also stands out here with having a higher average of worked hours per week. What we also see is that work on weekends is widespread. Well, I guess these lots of worked hours per week need to fit somewhere. Almost nobody works on weekends, never, or just once per month. And almost all work on weekends at least once per month. And a substantial amount of people, actually 10% on average, work every single weekend. What we also assessed is what people actually get paid for the work they do. Given the amount of work they put in, I would quantify the salaries that range between, on average, 1,400 euros netto to 1,800 euros netto per month as questionable. What is a positive of this is that in the Max Planck Society, there are actually fair contract durations. So what we see here is the contract duration in months. And we see this sharp peak here at 25 to 36 months. That means that the PhD working contract is on average 25 to 36 months long. And this is actually a direct consequence of a regulation that the Max Planck Society implemented some years ago, where they specified that PhD project contracts need to be at least 36 months long to match the duration that a PhD project usually takes. And this seems to have translated into contracts with the appropriate amount. Okay, so much for the basic stuff. This kind of maps out what a doctoral researcher, or who a doctoral researcher is in the Max Planck Society, how much they work, how much they earn, and what contracts they're on. I think the probably more interesting stuff is to look, for example, at how supervision of doctoral researchers plays out, what factors influence supervision and its quality, and what challenges supervision usually faces. The first question we asked there is how many PhDs are actually supervised by one PI in the Max Planck Society? And we find that the average number here is 10. So a PI has 10, on average 10, some even something like 30 doctoral researchers, which is in, kind of in conflict with the Max Planck Society's guidelines on PhD supervision, because these guidelines state that a PI should have no more than 8 doctoral researchers. It is somewhat alleviated, though, by the kind of supervision practice that we see. So this question here actually asked for the other doctoral researchers that the formal supervisor has. And in practice, the formal supervisor, so the person who in the end signs your degree, is often not the same person that is your day-to-day contact in doing your PhD, answering your questions. So we also asked how many other doctoral researchers does your direct supervisor have? So the person you meet with when you have day-to-day problems. And this number is actually 3. So the direct supervisor on average supervises 3 other doctoral researchers. And this is then again in accordance with the guidelines, because they explicitly state that if other experienced researchers are involved in the daily supervision, then higher numbers are permissible. So the kind of supervision hierarchy in Max Planck institutes looks like this. There are a couple of directors per institute, these directors formally supervise a huge number of doctoral researchers, and they barely see them. They just show up at the vivas in the end, at the defenses, and the day-to-day contact is usually handled by group leaders or senior postdocs that supervise the PhDs in practice. We also asked the doctoral researchers how often they meet their direct supervisor. This is now all about the direct supervisor because we figured this is the more important person when it comes to supervision. Quite a lot of people seem to meet their PI about once per week. Still, quite a large number meet their PI about once a month. And then there is even less that meet their PI less than once a month. And what really stands out here is the humanities, for which this number is about a third of the doctoral researchers. And this, I guess, can be explained by the different disciplinary culture that the humanities disciplines have, where it seems to be quite usual that people work for themselves for a long time, sit in libraries, study, and then they meet their supervisor rarely to discuss the progress. They're also less integrated in research groups and collaborate less. The frequency of meetings seems to translate directly to satisfaction of doctoral researchers. So this question, how often do you meet your direct supervisor to talk about your project? This is the grouping, and the color scale is please rate your overall satisfaction with your PhD. So the more blue, the more satisfied, the more red, the more dissatisfied. And you can see that people who meet their supervisor daily or weekly are on average more satisfied than people who meet their supervisor only monthly or less than once per month. Of course, this is just a correlation. This is not a causal analysis, but the correlation is at least there. We also asked doctoral researchers how they rate their supervisor in many respects. We grouped the responses here. So most of the supervisors are open to the ideas of the doctoral researchers and respect them. Most of the supervisors are informed about the current state of the project of the doctoral researchers. Most of the supervisors also have excellent knowledge of the research field. Also, many of them are available when the doctoral researchers need help and give helpful feedback on the research. When it comes to the support of the professional development, like establishing contacts and recommending conferences, the rating drops or starts to drop. Teaching doctoral researchers how to write papers seems to be also not that widespread. And when it comes to teaching how to write grant proposals, the number of doctoral researchers that disagree is actually the majority. If we group these answers and average the agreement to each of those statements, we can also compare that with another very interesting outcome variable, which is the thoughts of giving up the PhD project. So the graph I'm showing here is the grouping is the thoughts of giving up the PhD project, grouped by often, occasionally, rarely, or never. And the color coding is this average rating of the supervisor, which is the average of the graph I just showed you before. And we see that this rating of the supervisor directly translates to thoughts of giving up. So apparently, people who never think about giving up their PhD project also on average rate the supervisor better in many of the categories, and people who very often think about giving up rate their supervisor worse. In the Max Planck Society, we have a range of tools that try to facilitate supervision. One thing that is very widespread is the so-called thesis advisory committee. About 60% of doctoral researchers have that. A thesis advisory committee is a group of a minimum of 3 senior scientists that are together responsible for the progress of the thesis. Usually the primary supervisor is one of them, but the 2 others are senior scientists in the field that have no direct relationship to the primary supervisor. And this thesis advisory committee meets at least once a year with the doctoral researcher to discuss the overall progress, to give advice on how to proceed, and to also make sure that the project will be completed in time, and to come up with contingency plans and plans Bs and Cs if something doesn't work out. The thesis advisory committee is also there to help in case something happens to the primary supervisor. For example, they might leave the institution, fall ill, or the relationship might break down. And then the members of the thesis advisory committee are the primary resource to take over the supervision of the doctoral researcher. What is a bit less widespread in the Max Planck Society is a supervision agreement with the formal and or primary supervisor, a written project outline, PhD guidelines of the institute, or a written training plan. But only about 12% of doctoral researchers don't have any of these instruments. So the vast majority has at least one of those. We asked the doctoral researchers about common problems they encounter in supervision and try to assess whether these tools that try to facilitate supervision actually do something to help with these problems. The color coding here is the dark red is doctoral researchers that have none of these supporting instruments, and the pink is doctoral researchers that have at least one, and blue is always the total. And well, we asked them how often, or if they ever encountered problems regarding the supervision, for example, disagreement between supervisors, personality of the supervisors that are not experienced enough or not enough experts in the research group. And we can see that for these categories, there is not much difference between those that have these supervision agreements and those that don't. So apparently these tools cannot really fix the personality and expertise of the PI, well, to no one's surprise. But when it comes to, for example, having not enough encouragement or not enough feedback, we start to see quite a difference between those that have none of these supporting instruments and those that have at least one. So it seems that there's at least a correlation between these instruments being in place and enough encouragement and enough feedback. The same is true for the frequency of meetings and discussions. So asked about having not enough regular meetings, not enough scientific discussions, and not enough meetings. It's a bit weird, but we asked that twice, but apparently we did that. But anyways, there we see the same pattern. Where we don't see a pattern is that the people who complain about too many meetings, this apparently is also not fixed by having such an agreement. And then the control question, people who did not encounter any problems regarding the supervision, those are overrepresented in the group that have at least one of these supporting instruments. So the conclusion here is that, there seems to be at least a correlation between less problems and having at least one of these instruments. Well, and then, the last part of the survey results that I want to present is regarding the mental health of doctoral researchers. This has been a focus topic in our survey in 2017 and in 2019. In 2017, we asked a very first tentative question about this. We were actually not aware that there was much going on, and we just included one question. We asked doctoral researchers during your doctoral research, have you had health problems with any of the following conditions? And then we listed back pain, sleeplessness, chronic fatigue, depression, migraines, burnout, and eating disorders. And what we can see is that only a third of doctoral researchers suffer from none of these symptoms, and 2/3 suffer from at least one of those symptoms. This was an interesting and alarming finding at the time that we also took to the management of the Max Planck Society. And the feedback that we got was, yes, this is alarming, but these are only subjective reports and it's not very scientific. and yeah, not really reliable. So what we did then is in 2019, we set out to implement two clinical questionnaires that assess depression and anxiety. To make this finding a bit more substantiated and to also make it comparable with the literature about mental health conditions. So the first instrument that we used was the patient health questionnaire with 9 questions, short PHQ-9. And this wall of text that you see here, you don't need to read it. This is the question battery. So the doctoral researchers are asked, how often have you been bothered by the following over the past 2 weeks? And then the questionnaire lists a range of symptoms like little interest or pleasure in doing things or trouble concentrating on things. And then the answer possibilities are not at all, several days, more than half the days, and nearly every day. And depending on the answer, people get assigned points. And then based on the total sum of points, people get assigned a depression severity, which ranges from none to minimal depression, 0 to 4 points, mild depression, 5 to 9 points, moderate depression, 10 to 14, moderately severe, 15 to 19, and everything above is severe depression. And then if we look at the results of the 2019 survey, we see that about 18% of doctoral researchers suffer from moderately to severe depression. So these are the darker blue pie pieces here. And if we compare this to the general population in Germany in the same age group, so 18 to 34 years, we see that this number is about twice as high as in the general population, where the number is about 7.4%. And this is pretty alarming. So if 1 in 5 doctoral researchers suffers from moderate to severe depression, this is something to be concerned about. For anxiety, we used the state trait anxiety inventory, which is also an instrument that is quite frequently used. A very similar pattern. The doctoral researchers are asked, please read each statement below and then indicate how you either feel right now at this moment. This is to assess state anxiety, or how you generally feel. This is to assess the trait anxiety, where a trait is something that people kind of inherently have that doesn't change or changes very slowly in time. Whereas a state is something that people have in the moment and that can change rather quickly depending on the circumstances. And then, people are asked to rate the statement, I feel calm, tense, upset, relaxed, content, or worried. Also with the scale again, not at all, somewhat, moderately, or very much. And then they get points again. And since these questions are phrased positively and negatively, the point scales are also flipped for the positive and negative questions. And then again, point sums can be grouped into anxiety levels, where 6 to 10 points is no or low anxiety, moderate anxiety is 11 to 14 points, and high anxiety is 15 points or above. And then what we see again is that the levels of anxiety in the doctoral researchers we asked are very, very high. So for the state anxiety, about 67% of the doctoral researchers suffer from moderate or high anxiety. And for the trait anxiety, it's about 63%. Since these numbers are so similar, and they are very similar in every comparison we made, I'm only going to report the state anxiety from now on. And comparing with the general population, it's a bit more difficult here because there is no survey that disaggregated into age groups. So the only comparison we have is the general population for all age groups here in Germany. And for the general population, about 30% report at least one anxiety-related symptom within the last year. So we can see that again, the prevalence of anxiety in doctoral researchers seems to be about twice as high as in the general population. Now, having this as a baseline, just the number of people who seem to suffer from these symptoms, we can start looking at correlations with other factors again. First of all, demographic factors. Here we disaggregated the the depression severity, blue, no to minimal depression, to red, severe depression, into different factors. On the left are the disciplines, the three: biomedical, chemistry, physics, technology, and the humanities. Doesn't seem to be much of a difference. We see that when we disaggregate for nationality, that the German doctor researchers are the ones that seem to suffer the least from depression, whereas from citizens outside the EU, the numbers are a bit higher. We see that female doctor researchers have a bit of a higher prevalence than male doctor researchers. What is really concerning here is that people that identify with other gender representations have a drastically increased prevalence of depression. And what we also see is that the prevalence of depression seems to increase as people are pursuing their PhD project for longer. So this increase is not a lot, but at least it is there, and it kind of goes a bit against the argument that people who do doctoral research kind of self-select, or the people who have mental health problems already self-select into doing a doctoral project. So this prevalence increasing over time kind of suggests that there are at least some factors in doing a PhD that seem to make depression worse. For anxiety, we see kind of similar patterns as for depression. So we see that citizens outside the EU also suffer from a bit higher levels of anxiety. I mean, the anxiety levels are very high everywhere. It's not that any of these groups are exempt from this. It's just that there are a couple of groups that seem to be a bit worse off. Same for female doctor researchers. And then again, for when we disaggregate for first-year doctor researchers, second year and third year, here we see the trend even more clearly that the longer you do your doctoral research, the higher the prevalence of anxiety. We also looked at the relation of mental health to work intensity, because it seems that work intensity is one of the first likely culprits for these higher rates of mental health problems, because we have already seen that people work a lot and they take little time off. What you see here is the grouping is working hours in bins of 5 hours per week. So here we have 30 or less hours worked a week, and on the very right we have 70 or more hours worked a week. Those rightmost bins are a bit, or actually the three rightmost bins are a bit unreliable, because numbers tend to get rather low here. But in the groupings where the numbers of respondents are higher, we can see a trend that indicates that people who work a lot also have higher prevalences of depression. We kind of see the same, a bit weaker trend in work on weekends. So the grouping here is having worked on weekends never to having worked on weekends every weekend. And we also see that the prevalence of depression gets higher the more people work on weekends. We also looked at the relation of depression and anxiety to contract duration. Why? Because one of the hypotheses is that the kind of precarious working conditions that we have in academia also influence mental health to quite some extent. We do see a trend, a correlation between the prevalence of depression and the contract duration. The grouping here is contract duration from 6 to 12 months on the left to 48 months and above to the very right. And you can see that the people who report no to minimal depression, dark blue, and mild depression, the light blue, are also decreasing, increasing the longer the contracts are. And for anxiety, we see the same trend. Not very strong, but it's there. What is kind of the strongest trend that we identified in our data is actually the relation of depression and anxiety to the satisfaction with supervision. It seems that people who are very satisfied with the supervision are also less likely to have depressive or symptoms or anxiety. So the groupings here are reports of satisfaction with supervision from very satisfied to the left to very dissatisfied to the right. you can see that for the very satisfied people, about 2/3 have no to minimal depression, whereas for the very dissatisfied, this ratio flips and about only 1/3 reports no to minimal depression. And for the anxiety, the pattern I think is even stronger, where for the very dissatisfied, only about 12% of the people report having no anxiety at all. Okay, the kind of last thing that we correlated was the relation of anxiety to experiences of bullying and harassment. This was a very new thing we did in 2019. I think there is no other survey around that assessed both the prevalence of mental health symptoms as well as experiences with bullying and harassment in the same survey. And while the numbers are pretty low, thankfully, not many people report experiences with bullying and harassment. We also see trends here. So people who never experienced any bullying, have kind of the average levels of anxiety or the average prevalence. And then as experiences with bullying increase from once, occasionally, monthly to daily and weekly, the level of people who report no or low anxiety drops with an outlier here, which is, the numbers are pretty noisy because, as I said, thankfully so little people reported experiencing bullying daily. With harassment, it's the same story. People who experience harassment monthly or weekly are very anxious, no surprise. To kind of summarize all these correlations I just showed you, this plot is the correlation coefficient of each of these factors, with depression on the x-axis and with state anxiety on the y-axis. Depression and anxiety themselves are very correlated amongst each other, but this kind of serves as a ranking of importance of which of these factors might be most important for mental health problems. And what I just wanted to highlight here is that the three most important factors seem to be workload, the work environment and atmosphere, and the supervision. Psychological support of the institution, which groups kind of the existence of trainings and helplines and whatnot, is only middle ranking. And I like to highlight this because this psychological support is usually what institutions are first to offer when you tell them that people have mental health problems, because it's easy and it's cheap and it's kind of a band-aid for the problem. But what I think really causes the problems, I mean, caveat, we didn't do a causal analysis here, but what I personally think is the root cause of the problems are the structural factors that we see in academia, which is the workload, which is the high pressure work environment and atmosphere, and which is the supervision quality that is lacking in some cases. Okay, and with that, not yet the last section. This is a summary of what kind of improvements the Max Planck Society did in reaction to these results that we got from our surveys. In 2017, as I said, we presented these preliminary results for the first time and were immediately invited into the operational health management working group of the Max Planck Society. And in 2018, we managed to get deteriorating mental health recognized as an occupational hazard. This might sound a bit dry, but it's actually super important because occupational hazards are something that the employer is, has to take care of. If there's an occupational hazard, the employer has to minimize that. We also managed to make mental health of early career researchers the first focus topic of this operational health management efforts. And in 2019, the Max Planck Society launched an organization-wide employee and management assistance program, which is kind of a crisis hotline for everybody who's associated with the Max Planck Society, and offers professional counseling in many languages and is accessible 24/7. But as I showed you before, this is one of these instances where the organization is quick to offer psychological support, but the more structural causes like the workload and high pressure environment remain unaddressed. Okay, and then for the last part of my talk, what I promised you in the beginning, the ingredients to drive change. This is kind of a compilation of the experiences I made during my career in the representation of doctoral researchers. Just a kind of highlight best of list of obstacles that people who try to do something about the situation usually face. And I'm also going to try to give you at least some solutions for each of these obstacles, or how one could try to overcome them. So the first obstacle that we faced, especially in the beginning of our efforts, was a lack of credibility. So whenever we presented something, some wish to change something, a usual response that we would get was, yeah, well, that's only an opinion of an individual, and who are you speaking for anyways? And what we did to kind of address that is we really cranked up the professionalism in our representation. So we have statutes for the Max Planck PhDnet that we follow, that organize or detail how the elections are done. We follow our internal rules. We have very clear communication channels set up with institutional email addresses, etc. We have democratic elections. That was actually one of the major milestones here, because now we can really say that we speak for at least 50% of the doctoral researchers, because that's the quorum that is needed to elect an institute representative. And then the most important one of those is data, because we are dealing with researchers, with scientists here. Most of the people who manage research institutions have been scientists themselves. And usually if you present them compelling data, at some point they will cave in and start admitting that there is a problem. Then another obstacle that comes up quite a lot, especially when we talk about the representation of early career researchers, is the vulnerability of the individual. Who is going to step up and talk to the director or professor about a problem that exists at the institute? Because the director or professor in the end will grade the thesis of the doctoral researchers. So there might be an inherent fear of retribution there. This is very hard to overcome in my experience, because I think the risk cannot be eliminated completely. There's always a risk of retaliation if you deal with people who really can't take any criticism. But there are at least a couple of things that one can do to kind of alleviate the risk. The first is, again, professionalism. If you approach people professionally, it's more likely that they will approach you professionally as well. Then also knowledge of the system helps. So if you know your rights, if you know your rights as a worker, if you're well connected, for example, with the Works Council, that also helps to nip the retaliation in the bud. The democratic elections again help, because then you don't speak for yourself, but you speak for all the doctoral researchers that elected you. And you can also say that this is not your personal opinion or your personal attack on the person, but this is rather a voice of a common group. And then the third solution is kind of speaking to higher ups, because many research institutions do have some advisory board in place, some people who come to evaluate the institute every once in a while, and those people are usually not involved in the day-to-day supervision of doctoral researchers, and speaking to them, highlighting problems to them, can be a safer way than talking to the director themselves. Then another problem that we encountered a lot is the high fluctuation. So early career researchers are only at their institutions for 3 to 4 years. They fluctuate a lot. And a common problem is that, well, some initiative was started 2 years ago, but by now nobody knows what it was about anymore, and what was done there. This is something that cannot be changed. It's just systematic, and you need to be aware of that and the problems that it entails, and kind of work to counteract it by creating institutional knowledge in your representation, by documenting a lot, by sharing knowledge, by, for example, setting up an alumni organization of your representation, an advisory board of your organization, the old guys that used to be in the representation, maybe a WhatsApp group to ask them what happened 2 years ago, something like that. That really helps to keep on top of things. Internationality is an obstacle, because many people don't really know the rules when they come. What the fuck is the Works Council? Works Council or Betriebsrat is a very powerful instrument of employees, but the minority of people know about that. And educating people about that is work. And yeah, that can be done, for example, by onboarding people, by presenting the representation regularly, by creating onboarding info, flyers, whatnot, and by demanding or creating yourselves resources in English to have people find their way in the institution. And lastly, this is actually my favorite one, is fragmentation of responsibility. That's a usual strategy of institutions to not change something. And they usually tell you, well, we would love to change that. We totally recognize that it's a problem, but sadly, it's not our responsibility. This is especially prevalent, for example, if something is a state responsibility and not a country responsibility, or if it's the university's responsibility and not the institute's responsibility, and whatnot. And this is especially frustrating in combination with the high fluctuation of people, because in combination, this stuff takes a long time and people usually lose the courage or the motivation to follow up. So solutions to this problem is to kind of try to band together, form large groups that have the same opinion and move stuff on a larger basis, maybe even on a country level, to be persistent, to remind the management every once in a while that there is still an open point that you would like to have addressed. If necessary, escalate the higher ups. And last but not least, to put in the work yourself. If, for example, the management can't give you a list of all the email addresses of the doctoral researchers to organize an election, then you have to go door to door and collect these email addresses yourself. Okay, and with that, I have taken almost all the time. Yeah, I'm going to skip that slide and just give you links to the resources that I used in this presentation. So the 3 survey reports that I used for the results of the survey are all openly available. You can have a look. But I think more importantly are other helpful resources that you're free to use. For example, our survey, the materials are openly available. Some advice on how to form thesis advisory committees or how to write a good supervision agreement, an example of institutional guidelines for doing a PhD, and lastly, the statutes of the Max Planck PhDnet, which detail how the representation is organized. And with that, I'm done, and I'm happy to take some questions.